Good morning and welcome back to Energy Shots. I'm Joseph Majkut, Director of the Energy Program here at CSIS. And on this program, my colleague Kevin Book and I take a little deep dive into the data sets which explain the underlying stories between political and economic developments in energy. I'm joined today by Kevin in an undisclosed location. Kevin, it's nice to see you.
Good morning, Joseph.
Well, a lot has happened since over the last 2 weeks when I joined from a remote location. But importantly, we want to start with major shifts in U.S. public policy with respect to climate change. On February 12th, Lee Zeldin and President Trump announced that the United States Environmental Protection Agency would rescind the endangerment finding, the underlying legal rationale for the U.S. regulating greenhouse gas emissions, in this case from the light-duty vehicle fleet. What's your read on this situation?
Yeah, Joseph, I think the word you used that was operative was the word legal. So it doesn't really read like a climate document, it reads like a legal filing. And that seems like it was intended for 6 specific justices who wrote 2 rulings, West Virginia versus EPA and Loper Bright versus Raimondo, that underlie the arguments in the endangerment finding rollback. It has, a lot of questions have come up and we're still working on it. I think a lot of other people are still as well. What does it mean for the greenhouse gas reporting program? What does it mean for sectoral standards? GHGRP is one of those things where the EPA said if we're not going to regulate it, we're not going to count it. So I think we can sort of see where that might head. Sectoral standards are not as clear. The administration said they're looking at tailpipes, not looking at the sectoral standards yet, but the underlying logic raises questions about that. So it sets the stage maybe for a deep cut back to the methane rule for oil and gas. It also could inhibit new standards for a future administration. We have to think about pendulums and pendulum risks. Then I could go on, but just to close it out, one of the other things I think is that when former President Joe Biden in his inauguration speech said we should use the strength of our example rather than an example of our strength, one of the areas where I think his policy platform aimed to do that was on climate policy. And rolling back something that underpins all of the domestic programs that since Obama have been used to collateralize international negotiations seems like it could make that strength of example argument a lot harder.
Well, this is a very, your comment about this being a legal versus a scientific decision, I think is actually kind of interesting to me. We saw over the summer the DOE, Undersecretary Wright, publishing a report from 6 credentialed scientists, but a group that was quite skeptical of what you might call mainstream climate science narratives, or skeptical of the compelling risks associated with greenhouse gas warming, not really skeptical of its existence, to be clear. In that, that was positioned at the time as something that might inform the administration's thinking about climate regulations. But in the final document, we didn't see that played a big role. Do you have any sense of why that might be?
Well, the most obvious explanation, Joseph, could be to minimize target surface, attack surface for legal challenges. The climate working group became controversial in some respects, maybe not for the content, although that was an area that drew widespread criticism from environmental advocates, but also the process, because as a federal advisory commission, it wasn't properly constituted. And so I think what the administration did, and this is an important point, and I'm glad you brought it up, they said, we're not including it, but if you read the preamble, in the preamble, it also allows them to skirt questions that could be hooks for legal challenges. It says, because we're not including it, we're not addressing the science, we are solely making a legal argument, we don't have to talk about X, Y, and Z. And so I think to the extent that this was about trying to get the rollback done and remove impediments in court, that may explain it.
I think that's right. I think they're lawyers. They probably want to have an argument about administrative law. Courtrooms are not the right place to adjudicate scientific data and interpretations there too. But because I've got a former career as a climate scientist, I have to jump at the chance to talk a little bit about what we've learned about climate change in the data in the meantime, because there's been a lot of commentary, opinion pieces that have gone alongside this non-endangerment finding that are saying, well, this is also representing scientific reality. So I wanted to take us through just a couple data points to see both, was there any climate impact to the endangerment finding? And should we think that there has been any major change in the scientific storyline in the preceding 16, 17 years? Would you bear with me for a moment?
More than interested. I think I see where you're going here, Joseph.
So the first thing I'm going to show up on the board is atmospheric CO2 concentration. This is the famous Keeling curve, originally measured in Mauna Loa, now measured around the world. When the USG made its first endangerment finding in 2009, atmospheric CO2 was at 387 parts per million. And in the meantime, we had regulatory authority over greenhouse gases in the United States. We had the passage of the Paris Climate Agreement, or the signing of the Paris Climate Agreement. And now yet in 2025, we find ourselves at 427 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, and really no visible inflection in the growth of CO2 concentrations over that period. You know, I've written a lot over the years. I know you've written a lot over the years. Very hard problem, if you consider it a problem, the growing concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's a hard problem to manage with administrative tools and regulations in the United States. And when we think about the overall problem, this global commons issue associated with atmospheric CO2, it persists. Now, in the original... Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
Just on a point there, I think if you look at the preamble text, Section 5 sort of lays out the rationale. And the first argument they make is statutory, and the interpretation. They take issue with the interpretation. The second is the major questions argument. The third, I think I would summarize as futility.
Yeah.
They basically are saying that if you were to regulate every tailpipe in America to zero, you still wouldn't change that curve you just drew.
I think that's right. I mean, you know, the same argument holds, like if I'm on a diet, every donut I eat is going to very marginally affect my weight in 10 years. So the nature of the problem is a challenging one for regulation. Both I see it as in two ways. One, I think that's technically correct. The United States is 10% and falling of global greenhouse gas emissions. Tailpipe standards apply to even a smaller percentage of that overall total. And if it is a globally accumulating pollution problem, there's very little that emissions will do. Of course, we can get into cost benefit and social cost of carbon. We'll save that for another episode. Let's look at two more geological data sets, because I think it's actually interesting to update ourselves, kind of what has gone on since 2009. So in the original endangerment finding, the EPA highlighted two major effects of CO2 as it affects the global climate, both global temperature and sea level rise, because a lot of the damages that you might be concerned about spring from those two phenomena. I took a look at some of the data. This is imperfect, but because I'm not filtering for sort of year-to-year climate variation, but just take a look at what has happened since 2009. CO2 has gone up about 40 parts per million in the atmosphere, reflecting again growing emissions from around the world. And the real challenge of managing them with direct regulation in the kind that we use for other pollutants in the United States. Temperature rise has actually been relatively large. If you look at the year-to-year comparison over that time window versus last year, about a half a degree centigrade of global warming. Again, there's year-to-year variation, so you would need to, if you were making more rigorous climatological statements, you would want to do some filtering for that. But it tells you that, in the time preceding the endangerment finding, there was a lot of scientific argument about the pace of warming. Was there a pause? Were the models that we used to anticipate climate warming and its effects overheated? In the last 16 years, if you look at the NASA GISS temp, which is where I took their global temperature record, where I took this difference from, we've seen actually quite a bit of warming compared to the standards that the world has targeted for itself, 1.5 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial, 2 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial, et cetera. The one that really jumped out to me, however, Kevin, was the extent of sea level rise that we've seen over the same period. So this is using satellite altimetry data. Don't worry about zero, because we're not really comparing to pre-industrial here, but the change in that data set is about 6 centimeters over the last 17 years, reflecting what scientists now think across a variety of lines of evidence is accelerating sea level rise as we both warm the oceans and see faster melting of polar ice caps in Greenland and in Antarctica. And so in that, in these kind of major geophysical signals, over the time since we made the endangerment finding, we've seen persistent climate changes exactly as we would expect with continued atmospheric loading from CO2.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Well, so the question of futility and the contribution regulation can make takes us to tailpipes, because the way that this rollback was constructed was about the tailpipe emissions. And I think in this context, it's important to think about the relative impact of an EV taking the place of a internal combustion engine vehicle. And so what this chart shows is the gallons per year of consumption by an average light-duty vehicle in different fleets. These are ballpark estimates. The first one is pretty close to probably right, to the extent that these sort of estimates are right or wrong, using Federal Highway Administration data, dividing gallons by cars.
Americans like big trucks and drive a lot.
Well, we'll decompose it in a second, and that's definitely a big part of it. Globally, the impact is a little bit smaller, so 460 gallons per year down to 300. And in China, where they have less roadway extent, so less VMT per LDV, light-duty vehicle, also higher efficiency. So the point of this slide, and I think we should get to the next one in the spirit of time, is that if you supplement versus substitute, you don't get that impact at all necessarily.
Right.
The ICVs stay on the road, and so you can overcount what you get in the first instance. And so in the U.S., if you look over the 25 years through 2024 using FHWA data, you see a fairly significant decrease in VMT, about a 9.3% VMT, vehicle miles per light-duty vehicle, which is, thank you, the blue line. I can't point to it myself.
Yep.
And about a 3.4 mile per gallon implied increase so this is in light-duty vehicle fuel economy.
Right.
And this is sort of explaining that 460 number. What it means is that we're going from about 600 gallons per year down to that 460, which is a pretty big change. And a lot of that change is already cooked by the time of the endangerment finding. Not all of it, and there's an uptick at the end, which I think is significant. But maybe this is where we can move to some of the underlying factors in why things are changing. If you ask, where are the EVs in the United States, and you wanted to be a little flippant about it, you could say, well, they're in the blue states. And it's not an accident. There's a policy reason for that. That includes the California Clean Cars program and the cooperating states, 16 states plus the district, cooperating in different forms at different times with that program. And the concentration of EVs in the light-duty fleet in those states, the blue bars, you can see obviously California at the highest penetration, 7%, but blue skews to the front of the deck, and not that surprising. Now, you might ask, you mentioned the size of cars. Size of cars is an issue. If I look at the EV penetration correlations and I ask what's the correlation with VMT per capita or VMT per LDV, it's about a negative 0.5. So inverse correlation, meaningful, pretty strong, not super strong. If you look at it by the relationship to local government political polarity, so state houses and governors, it's about a negative 0.6, so slightly stronger, which is also about the same as the relationship between EV penetration and truckiness, to use a technical term, of the light-duty fleet. And so what I think we're getting at here, the big blue bubble in the upper left-hand corner of that chart is California, where you have this very high penetration, very large share of the total vehicle mix, which is the bubble size, and also very low VMT per LDV. And it's worth mentioning also a very high penetration of passenger cars in that fleet. That is not necessarily a template for a lot of the other states. The red states not adopting these policies have a lot to do maybe with ideology, but to some degree the fundamentals of the cars people use and how they use them. So where are we going from here? Well, first of all, subnational reactions to federal deregulation were the story in the first Trump administration. We called it a rollback rebound. A rollback rebound redux is possible. But there's also a rollback rebound response possible from the Trump administration, which has stated in an executive order from the president that they don't want state policies that are discordant with the national goals articulated from the White House. So watch this space. It's not just a legal question, it's also a fundamental question of the cars on the road. Meanwhile, EV penetration is rising all over the world, so we're not ignoring that story, just looking within the context, again, of that strength of the example. If the U.S. regulatory story is the underpinning by which American negotiators argued other emitting countries should up their ambition. Where does that story go now?
I think that story is going to have to be rewritten, Kevin, is my honest opinion. We titled
we have another story, though. There's another story to talk about.
We titled today's episode "Endangerment and Danger." Last week we talked our last episode we talked a lot and in quite detail about the potential energy security risks of a new conflict with Iran. In the meantime, the United States has continued to forward position military equipment with a new carrier headed to the Eastern Med as we speak. Markets are seeing risk, Kevin. I wanted to make a brief advertisement for published work here this week by Clay Siegel, our colleague and senior fellow here at CSIS, trying to break down the scenarios for how a conflagration or military conflict in the Gulf could affect energy security. Before we get into that, what's your read on the present situation?
Well, with the caveat that we all have a tendency towards recency bias, let's call this one latest news in recency bias. See what I did there?
Yes.
Come back to me on that one. So we heard from the president yesterday during his inaugural meeting with the Board of Peace that there could be action or decision within 10 days. In a subsequent comment, he mentioned that it might be 10 to 15 days. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is headed to Israel, I believe later in the month, February 28th. Foreign Minister, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has said that they're coming out with paperwork shortly, 2 to 3 days, to sort of physicalize the negotiations that were verbalized earlier this week. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, is apparently looking at how the template for a deal might work. So I think that the contours of progress are there, but at the same time, the gaps between the sides seem to be wide and maybe even widening. The U.S. has basically laid out a position that there's to be no nuclear enrichment. That may be maximalist and a starting point, but it would be a stronger position than the one taken in the JCPOA. The Iranians maintain that they want to keep their right to enrich, and they're not going to surrender it. Again, things can be maximalist at the beginning and converge, but in addition, there are other dimensions to the debate that goes beyond nuclear to ballistic missiles. The Iranians have drawn a red line there. So as it stands right now, we are on the precipice of potentially a fairly significant escalation and maybe a sustained military engagement, which is a little bit different from the targeted nature of the administration's interventions, both in June last year in Iran and also more recently in Venezuela.
And in our piece on the website, Clay did try to break down what that could mean for physical energy security. Of course, 16, almost 17 million barrels a day flows out of the Gulf. We're now, many of us, familiar with the threats to interrupted shipping. Clay lays out four scenarios of kind of what we could see as we escalate toward conflict or live through one. U.S. disrupting Iranian oil shipping to create economic pressure, a very successful model in the recent conflict with Venezuela, and one that the U.S. might try to repeat. And then, of course, Iran can play that game too, and has already indicated through naval exercises and drone flights that it might plan to do that as a potential escalatory mechanism, disrupting Gulf oil shipping out of the Strait of Hormuz itself. Now, of course, in our evaluation, both of those scenarios are moderate and reversible. If the U.S. Navy steps in, we could probably securitize a lot of that flow. And if a conflict were to end after a week or two or a month, say, then oil shipping could resume. The thing to watch for, and which Clay's piece does highlight novelly in recent weeks, is how air attacks against oil export infrastructure, things we've seen in Russia, we've seen in the Ukraine and Russia conflict, we've seen in the Gulf before, could create longer lasting and more severe price challenges and energy security issues, where the U.S. may choose to disable, U.S. or Israel may disable Iranian oil export facilities, or Iran may decide in feeling cornered, it would attempt to disable Gulf oil or gas export facilities. Kevin, markets are showing increased prices. There's a premium associated with geopolitics against what we expect the basic supply balance to tell us in the oil price. What are you thinking when we look at these scenarios?
Well, the expectation the market is showing is some sort of discounted fraction of the risk that we're talking about. We're talking about a lot of the Strait of Hormuz scenarios, for example, to say nothing of the more permanent and less reversible, not more permanent, but longer lasting and less easily reversed types of events, are medium to high double-digit numbers in terms of dollars per barrel impacts to the Brent price. Yeah. And so when we see $5 or $6 or $7 a barrel, we're seeing some sort of discounting on a probabilistic basis by the market. And it's a fool me once market that is starting to get a little bit wary. For last year, the market was not readily convinced that geopolitical risk was a problem. We got $13 per barrel of travel from trough to peak during the Iran conflict, and then it dropped away as soon as the conflict resolved. Now what we're seeing is a sort of a stickier and more persistent increase. If you, depending on where you want to start your yardstick, a $10 or $11 rise, maybe 6 or 7, depending on where you want to count from, and it's sticking around before any hot war type events have started. So I think the way we viewed it at Clearview for some time is the market has become a little bit sanguine and has been undercounting risk for a while. It's not clear that even now it's fully priced in.
Well, hopefully both are, those taking action in the Gulf are aware of these scenarios. My own assessment is that in Washington, we're kind of sleepwalking toward what could be a relatively severe energy security crisis with, these kind of scenario 3, 4 situations, as you say, pushing us well over $100 a barrel and potentially lasting for quite some time. So we'll keep an eye on it. Obviously, we're monitoring the situation. Me from Washington, you from an undisclosed remote location. And for those who joined us on Energy Shots, we're very grateful that you're here today. Kevin, any final words?
No, it's great to see you. Look forward to seeing you in person for our next episode.
Yes, excellent. We will be taking a 2-week hiatus, but we'll be back March 13th. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you have an energetic day.